Hello, everybody, and welcome aboard. If you came for a webinar on local research with people who use unregulated substances and lack stable housing, you're in the right place. Welcome. I think we have almost 200 people registered for this webinar today, and extend a warm welcome to all of you for taking time out of your day to be with us. With me today, I am privileged to have Jesse Burt from the AIDS Committee of Kitchener, Waterloo, and area, and Sarah Escobar, who's with House of Friendship and also brings a wealth of experience and expertise with her. So before we get going, just some acknowledgements at the very front end. What we're going to share is some of that local research. Just want to acknowledge that for some of us who are quite deeply affected by the drug poisoning crisis, there may be triggering moments for sure. Some of the material is fairly sensitive. If you feel the need to reach out, my colleague Shama is going to put the phone number for Here 24/7 in the chat line, or you may have colleagues you can rely on if you feel so triggered. And certainly some of the research we did was quite sensitive for the people we spoke with. I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous efforts from Jesse and the AIDS Committee of Kitchener-Waterloo and area. None of this would have happened without the heavy lifting that Jesse did. But also some of the folks from the YW Kitchener who helped deliver some of the surveys for the unsafe research. You should know that we'll be recording this webinar. But none of the participants will be identified. You won't see your face or anything like that. And after we're through some of the material, we'll be into a question and answer. Again, those are completely anonymous. So you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And there's no such thing as a bad question to ask. For many people here, I know it's new material and probably fairly mind-blowing. I mean, in the main, there's some suggestions from people who use drugs and some evidence to back it up that things would improve if we just provided pharmaceutical equivalents to the unregulated drugs that people are currently using and relying on. I'd like to acknowledge that today the three of us, Sarah, Jesse, and myself, are coming to you from the governor's house in Waterloo Region. We're right beside the KPL, and it housed the governor. It was purpose built, and then the governor's job was to take care of the county jail, the original county jail, just behind us here. And it's fitting, perhaps, that 170 or so years later, it now houses a national model for crime prevention through social development, and that is the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council. So perhaps a bit of poetic justice, but we'd also like to acknowledge that we're not that far from the Grand River, and land that was granted to our First Nations neighbors as part of the Haldeman Tract, again, also many years ago. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Sarah and Jesse. I don't know if you want to say a few words about yourself, but Jesse, do you want to start and Sarah follows?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Yeah, I'm just your everyday average outreach worker. Here to let you know about the survey that I helped complete. And yeah, I'm currently working for Aqua as a harm reduction worker. Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Escobar, and I have had the privilege of working in this community now for just over 20 years. And I think one of the exciting things about something like this taking place is A, seeing the amount of people that are interested, and B, seeing the distance we have gone in earning the bravery to have these discussions in an open, loving way, with a great host like Crime Prevention Council, who is open to these really difficult discussions. So super excited to be here and really excited about some of the questions and conversations.
Awesome, thank you both. And as I mentioned, we'll start with a little context setting here. In the little bit ahead of myself here. It would be, well, it would not be proper to ignore the fact that we have a market economy that is unregulated, that is feeding demand for unregulated substances right around the world. It's nearly $1 trillion industry. And the graph that you have in front of you is adapted from John Marks with permission. On the left side, you see sort of generic health and social problems. And at the bottom, you see different regulatory models. And the regulatory model we're in right now is on the bottom left. It's prohibition. And this graph would say, and I think it's backed up by decades of evidence, that it is a very harmful regulatory regime, and significant amount of evidence to suggest that that regulatory regime causes more harm than good, than the drugs themselves sometimes, right? And as you'll hear throughout the presentation, the notion of criminalization deeply affects the people we spoke with, but also infuses our culture in terms of how we offer services, who's eligible, who's not, what rules and regulations are in play, for example, the agencies, for example. On the right side, also at the top end, it's unbridled commercial promotion, right? There's very few regulations. Business entities can go full on with few government restrictions. And in the middle there, you sort of see strict regulation and legalization. And that's sort of where cannabis has moved recently in Canada. And there's been talks about other regulatory models. There's a bill before the Senate of Canada right now that short title is Health-Centered Approach to Substance Use. It's pitching a model that is really prohibition with criminalization. So we'll see if that bill moves anywhere. There was also a private member's bill introduced in Canada last week. We'll see if that goes anywhere. But the point is, 10 years ago, you'd be run off to the edge of town for even talking about prohibition. As Sarah said, we've come a long way in the meantime. So that's the broader regulatory regime. And for people who are using unregulated substances, they do not benefit from the same consumer health and safety protocols that legal products enjoy. And in that context, we sort of operate locally and more further afield from the sort of 4-pillar approach. And the idea here is, like in the existing structure, what can we do to prevent and or reduce some of the harms that might come from problematic substance use? And one of those pillars is related to the enforcements, the court and the corrections system. It is the pillar that is perhaps the dominant intervention in Canada historically and probably to the present day. Primary intervention being to enforce the criminal code and stream people through the court system and into corrections. And if you look at who's in corrections, my gosh, it's the majority of people would say addiction sort of landed them there. And but we have other pillars as well. There's a treatment pillar. Tries to steer people towards recovery and build the system capacity. That system has seen some improvements over the last few years, but if there's any notion in society that we can treat our way out of the drug poisoning crisis, I think we should put that to rest right away. And that's not to demean the value of treatment or all the substantial efforts that happen. It's just, there are simply too many people. And then of course, harm reduction. I know many of you on this call are engaged in harm reduction efforts. That aims to sort of prevent the harm, as you will. And then really the pillar that has the most effect on demand, right, is really the prevention pillar. It's the pillar with the greatest return on investment for society, It is one that starts in utero, if not early childhood, and throughout the lifespan, and really aims to prevent or delay the onset of substance use. And there's decades of evidence to point to what effective prevention measures are. What they are not is poster campaigns and education campaigns, just say no, that kind of thing. Those are largely ineffective interventions. Yeah, so if we think of the market economy in terms of supply and demand, it's the enforcement courts and corrections that attempt to sort of really mitigate the supply. Despite best efforts, we don't see a lot of effort, a lot of success in terms of reducing the availability of substances, in terms of affecting the price point of substances. And in that prohibition context, the history since 1908 really is that substances tend to become more dangerous over time. I did want to open it up to a poll. I mean, I have a bit of a sense of who's on this call, but Julie, I don't know if you want to pop that up, just so you know who else is here on the call. And I'd be remiss to say if we didn't have a local drug strategy that is working hard on all four of those pillars and attempting to integrate different systems and services. So Joanna might be on the call, but you can check them out. They have a website and trying to do great work in the face of unrelenting death, but also other harms. I mean, so much of the conversation in the last few years is tilted towards opioids, and rightly so, but we know that other substances are, including legal substances like alcohol, are still problematic for individuals and for society as a whole. So you see the poll in front of you. I'm not exactly sure how this works. This is first time through for many of us. I'm going to skip to the next slide here, and just a word on prevention, because it's really what the Crime Prevention Council would like to see more of. It is the pillar that is the most challenging to fund, and probably the pillar that most rubs up against sort of structural resistance, if you will. And we know at the Crime Prevention Council that, as many of you will as well, that the farther upstream we provide policies and programs, interventions, the more sort of social issues we can knock off. So the same kind of interventions that might be effective at preventing or delaying substance use would also improve people's health and well-being, would improve outcomes on educational attainment, labor market participation, and so on and so forth. So this is the challenge that is really before the Crime Prevention Council and before all of us. So moving to the next slide. Well, I just want to say a quick word about, he's called the father of social determinants of health, Rudolf Virchow, from 1848, suggesting that medicine is a social science and politics is really nothing but medicine on a really large scale. And for those of us paying attention to the COVID pandemic and the response, I think that's playing out in spades, where sometimes the science takes a backseat to other considerations. And so in this current context, what we end up with data like this, and I would suggest to you there is about a 0% chance that unregulated market is going to become safer or healthier. That is not the history, and the data continues to go the wrong way. On the left, you see these are fentanyls related deaths in Ontario up until November of 2020, so 11 months from last year. Fentanyls are the substance most implicated in fatal drug poisonings. And you can see those vertical lines. Those are times when the Crime Prevention Council has said, well, first in 2008, that we thought there was a fair chance that bootleg fentanyls would appear on the market at some point in the future and present a threat to public health and safety. In 2012, when OxyContin was removed from the market by the Purdue company, we convened some forums with our friends and colleagues in Guelph, Wellington, in really short order. And what they said, and diverse group, they said, oh, well, the supply will become more toxic and overdoses will increase and so on and so forth. And then that's exactly what happened. A year later, we issued what is likely the first advisory in Canada saying the bootleg fentanyls are here. And they were here in Quebec, they were here in Peterborough, and so on and so forth. So this crisis is something that many of us on this call have watched unfold and would all like to put an end to it. On the right side, you'll see the estimated number of overdose deaths in Waterloo Region last year. These are all substances, so not just the opioids. We often forget that people are being poisoned through use of crystal methamphetamine or cocaine, alcohol, and often they're mixed multiple substances involved in the death. For the research, we took very much an upstream sort of framework. So it's not just about the drugs, but it kind of is. And you see the quote there, it's not just about a toxic supply, but it's about all these other things. And as you'll see throughout the presentation, that there are impacts in other domains besides overdose, for example. So we looked at issues of acquisition, all the activities that people might engage in to acquire the funds to purchase the substances. We looked at issues of consumption. And what we heard loud and clear from participants was time and again, were different themes around criminalization, both the criminal code and sort of this carceral culture, if you will. And then finally, we dug in specifically to safe supply, the provision of pharmaceutical equivalents. And, you know, in considering issues of acquisition, I want to be really clear here that the findings are quite insightful, but they're not necessarily representative of all people who use unregulated substances. They're not representative of all people who lack stable housing, but those are the folks we talk to. And I think if you're in Southern Ontario, in that area, there will be some common themes for sure. And acquisition, I mean, I remember having a conversation with the former police chief, you know, a dozen years ago, and the thought locally was that about 80% of so-called acquisitive crimes were related to issues of addiction. And so we tested that. And I mentioned the data from people who are in our correctional systems at provincial and federal levels would lead to some clues. And then, you know, some anecdotal studies from police forces in Ontario where they talk to people who commit serial property crimes, and 100% of it is related to addiction. So we tested around issues of acquisition. We tested around issues of consumption, and it would be tremendous oversight to not to acknowledge that drug market, that unregulated drug market, and the conditions in which those drugs are manufactured, distributed, and then retailed at a sort of a local level. And I mentioned that the market is toxic. For a consumer, that means if you're buying something that you think is down, or maybe it's fentanyl, you don't know what kind of fentanyl is in it. You don't know what other chemicals are in it. You really have no idea. You also don't know the dose. And so there's a big difference between, you know, 3-methylfentanyl and furanol fentanyl and acetyl fentanyl. And there are hundreds of fentanyls that have contaminated the market. And but here we are, right? And they all carry a risk of death. What we talk about much less is the risk of injury. And there's not robust studies that have been done yet, but if you work in direct service, you'll know people who have suffered brain damage from overdosing. And then, of course, I mentioned there are no consumer health and safety protocols, despite the fact that, like, it's not a question of whether someone is going to die in Waterloo Region this week. It's a given that someone is going to die. And the early data through the OMARS system and the drug strategy care of police services shows that we're on about a similar trajectory as last year when it comes to opioid-related deaths. And you can see the upshot is, I mean, it literally drives substance use underground. The tunnel on the left is between Mexico and the USA. The lab on the right is a photo from a lab, and less than sterile conditions, obviously. And in the middle there is fentanyl. And for people who are consuming drugs, I mean, they don't have this kind of information. This is from Health Canada. It's the analysis of samples sent in by police forces across Canada. And I mean, there are 2,472 different chemicals on the last analysis. And you can see it's analogs of benzos, analogs of phenols, and so on and so forth. And then the final area that we sort of looked at is issues of criminalization. And that's the criminal code. So certainly possession is currently a criminal offense, but it's also those culture and the way we structured human service systems, who's eligible, who's not, what are the conditions in which you might engage with health and social services. And of course, we've been doing prohibition in Canada since 1908 with the Opium Act. And if you're under any illusion that that was grounded in science and evidence, I wouldn't be the only one on Turtle Island to tell you that that is simply not the case. It was absolutely rooted in racism, in particular Chinese racism. So those are some of the sort of the background here. If we consider issues of pharmacology versus phenomenology, phenomenology is those arbitrary human constructs. So it's the criminal code, it's the way we organize our human systems. What might be some of the properties of an opiate? Heroin, it could be hydromorphone, whatever it is. Well, if you're consuming those substances, euphoria, sedation, pain management is absolutely a function of the substance. If you're using the substances for long enough, you will experience withdrawal symptoms. If you stop using, constipation, decreased sex drive, appetite, those are all properties of the substance. What are not properties of the substances are picking up hepatitis C or HIV/AIDS. That's not a function of consuming the substances. Similar with overdose poisoning, if you have a known product with a known dose and you're using as prescribed, your risk of overdose is actually quite low. Similarly, you know, if you're injecting heroin or smoking fentanyl, it doesn't make you violent. It's quite the opposite. That stuff where you see violence in the drug markets is more at the upper levels. And in particular, there's some research to show that when the crackdowns happen in drug markets, that's really when the guns come out and the violence is at play. And finally, of course, we tested specifically around safe supply and really asked people, okay, what do you think would change in your life if instead of waking up in withdrawal, acquiring the means to buy the drugs, finding a dealer, buying the drugs, doing the drugs, and then repeating, what would happen, do you think, to yourself and to the community at large if you went to a pharmacy? And so that will be a feature in the research, both the focus group report that you'll see on our website, but also the unsafe product. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jesse and to dig a little bit more. Jesse?
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. So yeah, we've heard lots about so this notion of like nothing about us without us. And so the goal of the survey really was to hear directly from the folks who are experiencing this crisis. So 3 outreach workers, including myself, went out to different encampments and shelters and supportive housing throughout Kitchener, and we wanted to hear directly from folks. And again, we really want to stress that even though these results are insightful, this does not represent everyone who uses unregulated drugs or lacks stable housing. Next slide, Michael. So we really wanted to get a good sample size, and we really tried to have like a diverse, well-balanced group of people. Really, the important thing, like it's just an interesting thing to note, is the 35% of people surveyed had been in foster care or some sort of government care as a child. But as you can see there, almost everyone was on ODSP or OW. So this is like a breakdown of all the different substances that we asked about. And again, we have to remember that people use substances for all kinds of reasons. You can't just narrow it down to one reason, but there's all kinds of reasons, and each substance in itself for a different reason. We have opioids such as fentanyl that I want to highlight, which was the most regularly used substance. And another point of highlight is the fact that everyone had tried crystal meth, which is a stimulant. And for all the nerds out there, it seems like crack cocaine is somewhat making a comeback. So here is a summary of sort of that last slide. We had sort of a lot of combined use, a lot of stimulant and opioid use combined with an average. So people have been using for a long time too. So that 77% of people who are using fentanyl regularly were averaging about 4 years of use. And the 65% who are using crystal meth regularly, they were averaging about over the last 5 years they've been using. And then as we can see with the methadone and Suboxone, while traditional replacement therapies work for some folks, it doesn't work for everyone. And the 77%, it didn't fully work for them for various reasons, especially those who were on stimulants. And the other important thing to note about this is at the bottom there, we asked people about how they prefer to take their drugs. Fentanyl, I was surprised to see that people prefer to actually smoke their fentanyl rather than inject it, and that people rather inject their crystal meth rather than smoke it. And that'll be important later on. So this slide, sadly, it speaks for itself. What's really hard as an outreach worker is seeing how tight-knit the community is and how much overdoses impact one another. And I don't have to explain to this group how traumatizing that is for everyone else around. Some individuals had even overdosed dozens of times, and they expressed how they didn't even know how or why they're still alive. And we really want to get people to understand the language behind this. Like the reason that we're saying accidental overdose poisoning is super important to us because, as Michael said, I have an example of someone who, when I was working at a shelter, they had overdosed in their bathroom. And they were just lucky enough to have the roommate come in, and just so happened to be lucky enough for the roommate to need to go use the washroom to find the individual. And staff were able to respond in time, gave them naloxone. They went off to the hospital. But as we reconvened as staff, we were wondering, like, how did this happen? We know this individual. He only uses stimulants. He only uses cocaine. How did this happen? And when he got back, we asked him, and he also said, "I don't know. I took what I thought was cocaine, but it turns out I just overdosed on fentanyl." And as someone who has zero tolerance for opioids, that was a deadly situation, as he was so lucky because typically he would never have to use with anyone else. He never had to do that practice. He could use alone for most of his life, but in this instance, he was poisoned, and that's why it's very scary for everyone. No one is safe in these scenarios. So talking about shelters, since majority were staying in shelters that did the survey, we asked about the resources inside shelters. 91% said they wanted permitted substance use on site, ideally supervised consumption on site in shelters. Mainly, they had said banning substance use doesn't stop it from happening. It just forces people to hide, which really increases people's risk for fatal overdoses and injuries. Staff are put in these awful situations. I've experienced this firsthand many times, and it's honestly just traumatizing for everyone else around. There was during the start of COVID, there was actually a shelter that opened up, and it was a low barrier shelter. It was somewhere in Ontario, and they came out with a report that said they allowed substance use inside and outside of the shelter. That they surveyed the staff, and you can read some of these quotes here that people had said, but the report suggests that overall is very successful. It was their method of allowing substance use on site allowed both guests and staff to be safe. They had no fatal overdoses, even though they had no medical staff on site. We've kind of made consumption sites sort of this complex idea, but in reality, it's just a set of eyes on someone. Next slide. So the same shelter, because they heard about this new trend that's coming out that people are switching to smoking more now. They're fentanyl rather than injecting. They actually built this structure off to the right here. You can see that allowed for safe smoking outside, but where staff were able to still supervise people, and this reduced the amount of unsafe use, hiding in the bathroom, sort of the really sticky situations both staff and guests find themselves in, really the harms that are coming out of that. There's actually data coming out of BC that shows that there's more smoking related deaths now than injecting. And so that's a trend that we're starting to see here as well.
Thanks, Jesse. Just to put a bit of a cap on it, since we are talking about structures, about a year ago, or so, Health Canada provided something called a process called the UPHNS, the Urgent Public Health Need Sites. So this is an application that's available to any organization in Canada that wishes, as part of a COVID response, to open a consumption services in their organization on site, wherever that may be. So I just want to draw your attention to that. There's a bit more information at that web link, not the application itself, but a bit of an FAQ. And we've seen, I don't know, I think it's about maybe 4 communities in Ontario, there may be more, that have opened up consumption services, sanctioned consumption services in their shelters or their organizations. Health Canada turns around that application in about 5 days. So it might be an option for some of the folks here who are concerned about, particularly in the context of COVID, where, a year ago or so, it was a year ago, really was advising folks in Canada that I fully expected the supply chain to be disrupted, and some of those other measures related to COVID would likely increase overdose fatalities. And you hope you're wrong, really wrong, when you say that kind of stuff. That has not been the case. Overdoses, opioid-related overdoses are up 59% in Ontario in those first 11 months. Those are just the opioids. So it might be a measure that folks here want to consider. We asked some questions around COVID. We won't go into great detail here, but and for us, the COVID period coincided with the declaration of the emergency declaration in Ontario at the end of March last year, and people were answering questions about 4 months into the pandemic. 84% said the price of drugs had risen, and 67% said the quality of drugs had changed. And people in direct service or in hospital environments here may remember when the benzodiazepines were cut into the substances last summer, and all the impacts that had. And I mean, that's the trend, right? We know that at least 16 people died from benzo analogs in Waterloo Region in the first 8 months of last year. We expect that to be a trend that continues. So now back over to Jesse for a little bit more on the research.
Yeah. So what was really mind-blowing for me was when I asked folks how much they were spending on their unregulated drugs per day, because I saw that I got to write down how often they'd used and how long they've been using for, but I wanted to know how much they were spending. And this was $120 a day. This was mind-blowing to me. I got to sit there and actually do the math with people as we figured out, okay, how many points do you use of this and this, or do you a ball or a quarter? But I ended up averaging $120 a day. I can't afford that, which really begs the question of like, how is this possible? And this is what we mean by acquisition. We don't want to just focus on consumption and the overdoses, but we want to focus on all of the steps taken in order to purchase the unregulated drugs. But before I get into all those details, I wanted to really talk about draw everyone's attention to one of the most common themes that came out of the survey, out of the interviews for me was this idea that people are just trying to self-manage a medical problem. People are stuck in this endless cycle of trying to feel normal. And it's scary because no one wanted to be in this position. Everyone is just going through withdrawal, and sometimes withdrawals can set in just a few hours after their last consumption. And so it's just an endless cycle people are in, and it's all sort of this idea that they're sick and they just want to feel normal again. And these quotes summarize it beautifully. So I'll let you just read those, and then I'll move on to. So I really just want you to keep that in mind as we move on into the next couple of sections. That is withdrawal management. So their day usually starts, again, what Michael said, waking up in withdrawal. And that means they need to make the money, $120 a day. And this includes a combination of legal and illegal activities. So such as shoplifting, stealing bikes, breaking into sheds. There's survival sex work. And again, survival because the notion of choice really becomes blurry here. Selling drugs, most people aren't doing it to get rich by any means. They're doing it for the same reason. They're just trying to stay off their withdrawal and to feed their own $120 a day. Recycling, meaning like scrapping metal, collecting cans. All of this takes hours and hours and significant amount of time and energy and resources. Most described, so the best way to describe it is a full-time job. But however, these full-time jobs really expose people to a lot of violent situations, and they often get victimized because of these jobs. And it's an endless cycle of withdrawal, doing the full-time job, purchasing, consuming, then going into withdrawal, doing their full-time job, etc.
Thanks, Jesse. We did ask questions about, and these were kind of challenging questions, if people had participated in an activity excluding simple possession that would put them in conflict with the law. And you can see here, most people had, and 46% of folks were engaging in those activities daily. That's pretty significant. And it may be why in some communities you see business improvement associations advocating for safe supply. You see more in Europe, you see police forces advocating for safe supply and so on and so forth, because it has put such a dent in crime in the ways that some of those other interventions can't. We also asked people about incarceration, and it's off the charts. 42 of the 43 people we spoke to had been incarcerated as an adult. The average number of stints was 12. So it's a bunch of takeaways here, and we're privy to sort of all the raw data here, but one way to look at it is, well, not very effective. Another way to look at it is, well, we just spend millions and millions of public dollars for an intervention that arguably puts people at greater risk when they come out. But another way to look at it, and I think this is the main takeaway for us, is incarceration is neither desired nor is it a deterrent to engaging in crime, and in that effort to self-manage what is a medical disability in Ontario, care of the Ontario Human Rights Code. We asked people about victimization. We knew anecdotally from our collective work with people in these sort of environments that victimization often happens, and you can see here that it's in full swing. We were not wrong. 16% of people report being victimized every day, and the vast majority of people will never report those incidents to police. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but here we are, and that's unlikely to change today or tomorrow. To sort of summarize here what we learned we learned lots more than we're sharing here today, but avoiding withdrawal is really what people are all about in our survey. They're petrified of the unregulated drug market. Nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to engage in criminal activity to fund the habit. They spoke of the importance of relationships and maybe getting away from some of those abusive types of relationships. We heard loud and clear that the absence of sort of decriminalized spaces creates risks that, as Jesse said, just because consumption is not permitted doesn't mean consumption doesn't happen. It just happens in riskier environments, in the the bushes behind the shelter, in the washroom stall at an organization, and that creates tremendous risk for people who are using substances, but also for people who, like Jesse, like Sarah, who try to monitor for that. And if you've ever tried to pull someone out of a washroom stall who's on the brink of death, well, no fun for anyone. So we tested specifically about safe supply, and Jesse's going to walk us through some of those results.
Yeah, so like, what is safe supply? Like this is the definition that Michael and I have landed on, and I think is the best way to describe it. Really, the idea is replacing the individual's unknown contaminated drugs with a pharmaceutical equivalent from, let's say, a pharmacy. Remember the prohibition paradox that U-shape? Essentially what this is doing is moving those substances down into a strict regulated means, so that only those who are eligible can get a prescription in replacement of what they're currently using. It'd be great to open up the chat with this, but like there's so many ways that we could implement this. So the impacts on the individual, now when they wake up in the morning and they might be experiencing with a little bit of withdrawal, at some point, any point in the day, they can walk over to their pharmacy and get their dose anytime for free. And what this does for individuals is that means there's no more $120 a day, no more looming withdrawals, no more painful activities that might put them in conflict with the law, no more risk of being poisoned. When I got to explain this concept to people during the interview, it was the longest pause in the interview. I thought in the back of my head as a support worker, I was thinking, oh, they're gonna say they're stable enough and they're gonna want to get out of the shelter, get housed, or get a job, or maybe go see that medical person that they've been neglecting to see, to check out that thing they've been neglecting. And I thought like, oh, they're gonna be stable enough to do all of these things. And so like I already had all these sort of notions in my head of what they're going to say. But after the long pause and they were thinking about it, after I presented this idea, the majority of the responses, the first thing out of people's mouths was usually, I want to see my family again. Like, I want to see my son again. I want to see my daughter again. And because right now they can't. They can't when they have, either because of legal reasons and they've been removed from the situation, or they've removed themselves from their healthy relationships because of the shame they feel, because of the risk of overdose they have, or the fact that they have to sort of commit sort of activities that they don't want to expose their closest friends and family to. Next slide. So it will hopefully end this cycle, this endless cycle that people are in, and this will really provide stability and autonomy. That's sort of the main focus, and it'll just give people hours of their life back. We'll hopefully be able to start to see that people will start to make healthier choices for themselves over the long term. And people spoke about all of these positive things after speaking about family as their number one sort of thing. And that makes sense. Addiction, the opposite of addiction is actually connection. And so that makes sense that people spoke first about their relationships. And then after giving it some more thought, that's when people spoke about, oh, I'd be stable enough to get my own place. I could afford a place. I could actually be stable enough to maybe start to work again. I haven't done that in years. I would want to do that. like they have, all of a sudden they would actually be able to have goals again. And some even spoke about maybe hopefully moving into abstinence-based treatment after being stable and after figuring out all of these pieces. This is just a question that I asked. There's going to be a few of them that I asked at the very end of the survey, just to get sort of a summary for everyone. This is a good way to summarize it, and that's, how would this sort of a program, if they were put on a safe supply program, how would it impact victimization throughout the whole community? So zooming out, it's not just radically changes and reduces the harm for that person, that individual, but the community around them. And people talked about how there'd be a lot less victimization that would happen to themselves and to everyone else around them. When I asked about crime, how that would impact the community. These quotes, again, summarize it beautifully. These are directly from what people were saying. And again, I wanted to stress to people that that no one wanted to steal, and that when I heard people's stories and I got to hear their background and where they came from and how they got there, I would make the same choices that they were making. And so that was what really stood out to me. I also asked about just if they would see any change in sex work. And most individuals, again, said that there would be a reduction in sex work. I couldn't begin to tell you how many painful stories and I heard. And what really hurts is that knowing that most of them will never see the light of day. And yeah, it was just painful. And the last one being how this affects homelessness in our community. And this is something that affects so many people and so many organizations I know that are on this call. People who said that they would, if they got on a safe supply program, it would radically reduce homelessness and they would get them stable enough to actually move along that continuum. As someone who works inside of a shelter, I can tell you that we cannot address homelessness without looking into drug policy.
Thanks, Jesse. And you know, what Jesse, well, some of the research findings around homelessness, around sex work, around crime, victimization, and there are others. You know, what we found was largely substantiated by the international evidence. Most of that evidence has been gathered in a more therapeutic type context, but not exclusively. We've seen good results in say for around homelessness, for example, or in treatment or prevention of medical conditions, around sex work, labor market participation, from some of the safe supply programs in Canada, including one just down the road in London, Ontario. So, and in the main, these programs are working with people who are left behind through no fault of their own. They are marginalized by the structures and systems. And you know, I know it's popular to say, oh, overdose can affect anyone or can affect everyone. And that's kind of true, but it's kind of not. Like, that's not who's dying. And who's dying, those impacts are disproportionately spread. So if we're considering people who are unhoused, yeah, they're at highly elevated risk of dying from drug poisoning compared to their neighbors who are housed. If we consider income as a determinant of health, absolutely, you know, the lowest quintile in Ontario by income, in those neighborhoods, they're dying at 3.5 times the rate of their upper income neighbors. We saw through the ODPRN, and I think Shama's sent out the link to that, but in a post-COVID or during COVID, we saw higher rates of drug poisoning fatalities in sort of multicultural neighborhoods, if you will. And we don't have a lot of really great race-based data in Ontario. If we're considering impact on Canada, on First Peoples, I remember the time in 2009 where the NAN territory, you know, north of Thunder Bay, declared a state of emergency, and that was more related to the overprescribing, dosage and duration of prescription opioids. But since that time, more out of British Columbia, it is vastly disproportional impact on folks. And of course, the primary intervention is throw $1 million at the problem and incarcerate people for a year. So and I don't mean to sound derogatory. It's not the intention towards our colleagues in enforcement and the court system and justice, that the law is what the law is. But in terms of those community level expectations, people expected less of that cycle in and out of jail. They expected less of a burden to people working in direct service, at nonprofits, among first responders, among emergency rooms, and in the main, reduced financial burden on all three of those sectors: public, private, and not-for-profit. Whether it's reductions in shoplifting, whether it's reductions in emergency room visits and admissions, or whether it's reductions in the criminal justice system. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the research, and that is a bit of a nutshell. If you're wondering about the political support and other kinds of support for safe supply, it does exist. And in 2019, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the voice of Canadian municipalities, endorsed safe supply in a resolution right here in Kitchener in September 2019. The City of Kitchener put forward, and it was passed unanimously, a very forward-thinking resolution on safe supply. The City of Waterloo has made overtures about improving drug policy. The drug strategy has an amazing statement on safe supply available on their website. And then there are dozens outside of this region. In terms of regulatory and clinical support, the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons issued a bit of a statement at the end of last year. And I mean, to nutshell it, it says, compared to the unregulated market, safe supply is a much more life-affirming, healthier choice. But we see support from all kinds of quasi-regulatory bodies and evidence to sort of back that up. And then on a provincial level, British Columbia was really first out of the gate. And they're really still getting going, but really expanded the scope of practice for prescribers to offer safe supply, particularly in that pandemic context. Quebec has issued guidelines, and of course, Health Canada continues to be supportive and fund a few projects across Canada. But is it enough? No. Is there a money tree in the backyard of the governor's house? No, there's not. And if the history of moving forward on drug-related issues is any indicator, it really will take a community to help pull us out of this mess. So to summarize, I mean, access to all those kinds of services, and importantly, like retention in those kinds of services, and is highly dependent on the acquisition, the consumption, and criminalization of unregulated drugs. And that there are significant benefits by removing criminalization via safe supply. I mean, think about it. You decriminalize someone's life literally overnight, and that changes conversations, that changes the opportunities for engagement, and it changes the opportunities for retention. And there's evidence to back that up, not just because we heard it from the people we spoke with. Of course, crime and victimization are significant and underreported events, and some of those numbers are just gross. And of course, we found clear support for safe supply, for offering some on-site consumption services rather than sort of happening underground or in the washroom stalls, and then support for harm reduction supplies on site in congregate settings. So next steps for us, you're going to get a survey at the end of this webinar, and highly encourage you to fill it out. We're going to pay really close attention to what people on this call say about the questions that are being asked there. We would encourage you to dig into the reports. This stuff is counterintuitive, right? The notion that you provide a safe place for people to consume drugs, or you provide safe drugs, that good things happen, and not just with overdoses, but in terms of homelessness and health and medical conditions and so on and so forth. So I encourage you to share and talk it up amongst folks. The Crime Prevention Council has established a working group where it's early days still, so there may be an opportunity for folks to get together and have those discussions about how to advance it. There's nothing to prevent prescribers from doing it today, but not on the population level when we're talking about thousands and thousands of people across Waterloo Region who would benefit from, for example, safe supply. Jesse tells me there's a Facebook group called Safe Supply Advocates. I'm not on the Facebook, as they say, but you'd probably meet Jesse in those chat rooms there. And of course, lots of advocacy to be done. Yes, safe supply could happen, but there are some structural barriers that, with their removal, like the Ontario formulary, for example, things would vastly improve and provide a more robust and safer clinical experience. So we've got a couple of survey questions before we move into the question and answer. These are all completely anonymous. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but we want to lob a couple of questions at you, and we'll provide the results on the website in a really short report in the weeks ahead. So if you want to take a look at poll number 2 and take a few moments to answer the questions, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so strong support. I think about 68% of folks on the call, and I know we had like almost 200 registered. I have no idea how many people are here now, but no, and a couple of strongly disagreeing. Cool. Let's have those conversations for sure. Decriminalizing consumption areas provided in congregate settings. 73% of you said urgent. 21% maybe so. You know, if looks like support there. I'm reminded of, and I don't know if, I think Shama might have flipped it out on the link. We did a forum with, at the time it was the Regional Social Planning Division, in advance of creating the Homelessness to Housing Stability Strategy. It was 2009. I think the report's on the Crime Prevention Council website. And we heard from a bunch of different programs that provided consumption or harm reduction type approaches in housing and shelter environments. I remember, I think there were 27 of 42 filled out the survey, 88% were in support. So here we are 12 years later with similar kind of support. I've lost that question 3, but that's okay. Oh, there it is. Julie Thompson, you are amazing. Where are we at? Drug policy, legalization with strict regulation. Wow, you are a saucy bunch. And 14% with in favor of prohibition with decriminalization. So we did provide a bit of a response from Crime Prevention on the Senate bill. That's S229. I think it's up for second reading later this month. We'll see if it goes anywhere. But you know, compared to 10 years ago, we're having conversations about decriminalization and legalization. So fascinating times that we live in. I mentioned we'll take some Q&A here. We're going to take a short 2-minute break, not a long 2-minute break, and we'll be right back. If you have questions, pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll see you very shortly. Oh, hey everybody, welcome back. We'll get into some of the Q&A here. I see people are filling stuff in. That's excellent. We love the engagement. I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug for the Friends of Crime Prevention. You don't get a lot of spam and that kind of stuff. No amazing offers. Act now, do not delay. But we can let you know about upcoming events, perhaps items of local or perhaps national interest. So that's something that you may want to take advantage of. There's an upstream series in the works, a speaker series. So you'll be the first to know, and who doesn't like to be the first sometimes. I'd also like to just extend a thank you to the team behind this webinar. Done a phenomenal job in terms of putting the slides and all the technical details. They have names like Shama, like Abby, like Julie, and like Amy and Mariana. These are some of the staff with the Crime Prevention Council that have helped put on this event for you today. I hope you liked it. I hope you filled out the survey. It will make all of us proud. I would also be remiss if I didn't extend a tremendous thank you to our former executive director, Christiane Sadler, and the members of the Crime Prevention Council, which is, sort of a community-led body dedicated to social development and with a strong interest and knowledge on issues of equity, on issues of upstream prevention and what that really means. So that that body has been in existence for, I think, 26 years now. So the vision of the founders and the continued support from the region of Waterloo, and really the active membership that is the Crime Prevention Council, it's provides this kind of space to do this kind of research, to help drive policy and practice, not just locally, but right across Canada. So without further ado, we've got some questions in the chat. I just wanted to, before we get going, just connect with Jesse and Sarah.
Michael,
So,
can
yes,
you stop
hey.
sharing your screen, please?
Oh, if you insist.
That way we get to see everyone.
There we go. Oh yeah, we do have faces. I forgot. My first question is just towards Jesse. I mean, you delivered a substantial portion of those surveys in a variety of environments. And I know, like, we had some expectations about what we might find. Was there anything that you found particularly surprising, or anything you'd like to share that way quickly?
Yeah. What was surprising to me was honestly the $120 a day. Knowing that I was like a support worker and I was direct service, and I knew about all these concepts. I knew about, like, because I see them firsthand every day. I see the threat of overdose. I see sort of people not calling the police when they get victimized, or the amount of theft that happens and victimization that happens within the community themselves. But I guess I was very surprised by that number of how high it was, and just the fact that, like, I was surprised by the conversation, the quality of the conversation that changed when people really saw that I saw them with, like, having a medical disability, rather than being some really awful slang terms, or being a criminal. Like, I view them as having a medical problem. And I realized that people just can't talk about their addiction because it's illegal. They can't talk about it. And what's mind blowing to me is that, like, in terms of if everyone was passionate about treatment or recovery, if you can't talk about it, then that's the first step. And so, like, you can't do anything until you're able to, like, talk about it freely and openly. But because it's illegal, like, what they're acquiring is illegal and how they acquire it is illegal, then the people can't talk about it. And so most of the stuff, even as a direct support worker, I didn't even know what was happening in the background. I just saw all the negative stuff, and I only saw a little bit of it. There's a lot more that I don't even see or know about. And so that was kind of like the mind-blowing shift for me. And so, like, that directly impacts all the way that we do services and how we do services. That radically changes how we understand things and how we how we try to serve people. Like, it just, yeah, it changes a lot for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Jesse mentioned $120 a day. I think it was like $44,000 a year. Just fun facts, or not, as the case may be. I'm familiar with a study that was done in Toronto about a decade ago. You account for inflation, the cost of untreated opioid addiction in Ontario would be north of $70,000 in today's dollars. A lot of that is lost labor productivity, but also criminal justice system and so on and so forth. So you can see some of the dollar comparison. I think that to do hydromorphone, for example, it's not the best option, like in the formulation in Ontario, but we're looking at a few $1,000s. So yeah,
that I actually want to add on to that is that just how mind blowing it was to, like, hear the average number of people, like the average number of times that someone was incarcerated was 12. Like, the fact that people just came right back out and started to use again, and then started to go right back into it, and, like, nothing changed for them. Like, it was not, yeah, you think after, like, oh, we just, like, so all the individuals that really think that we need to, like, be stricter and have, like, longer or harder punishments, it doesn't deter people when you have a medical condition. It doesn't. And so what was mind blowing is the fact that that just kept happening over and over and over and over again. And so it didn't change, didn't deter people. Some of these individuals have been, it's kind of like that $1 million Murray example. I'm not sure how many people in the are watching know that example of just, like, how much one individual can take up a lot of resources and a lot of time.
Right, and $1 million Murray, I think it was a couple of police officers. They ended up just renting the guy an apartment, and then the magic happened, right? Yeah. Sarah, you've been lots of experience and expertise. You're familiar with the research. Was to sort of gel with your experiences over the years?
It does. It was actually surprising to see how safe people felt and able to share with the outreach workers that went out to actually ask the survey questions, which I think we have to give credit to the work that is actually being done at the ground level, at the street level, and those workers that are actually going out and meeting folks, because I think that that in itself is tremendous. The fact that people feel safe to share such delicate information, personal information, and at some points relive some of the traumas that they have already experienced. And so I want to make sure that that goes out to all of the frontline workers out there. You're doing good work. People feel loved. Keep that up because that is so important. And I think that's one of the biggest things that this region was brave enough to do a while back, which was to acknowledge that to be able to do this work and for us to be able to stay healthy and safe doing this work, love has to play a role. And we can do that in a safe, smart, logical way. It doesn't have to be freelance, crazy, irrational thinking. Love can be thoughtful and caring and structured, and created to create safety, which is what this is. This is a loving example of a community coming together in a brave way, in a brave format, to ask difficult questions and to host a safe space, and host safe conversations where we can actually get into the really uncomfortable, challenging information that we may not have yet. The only way that we're going to come up with answers and we're going to be able to do some good learning is by trusting each other and feeling safe with each other to have these conversations. So, for example, I appreciate there was the 7% that strongly disagreed. I hope that you're feeling safe in this space to ask some difficult questions, because that's really what we want to get to. We want to be able to understand what people, what makes this thinking difficult. Why is it separate than a public health concern? And so, yeah, let's get into those conversations. I'm excited to be here, and to see that so many people are interested and are sharing that love for the community with us.
Thank you. Yeah, the job of a direct service worker, outreach worker, it's changed so much over the years.
So much. Yeah, I think you and I were commenting. I think that, and I've made this comment to a few of the young staff that I have the privilege of working with right now at House of Friendship. Hey, everybody, I see some of you guys are on here, doing tremendous work. And I honestly don't know if 22 years ago, this is what the environment looked like, this is what the math looked like when I started. I mean, I've had some really strong, beautiful role models that have shown me how to do this work in many different ways. But this is heavy-hearted work. It is difficult. You're dealing with deaths of people that we love and connect with and call friends. And so, this is a difficult time to start this job. So give yourself credits, let yourself learn, let yourself love, and reach out, ask questions, connect with folks that have been around for a bit. But let yourself love.
Yeah. Take a look at the questions here, and if your question doesn't get answered, it's probably because we're running out of time. But so don't take it personally. We're going to keep track of the question, and we started to put together frequently asked questions. So the first one to come live is why don't people who use drugs think similarly about opioid replacement options? It's a good question. I don't know if Jesse or Sarah, if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I would love to take a stab at that. So this one is one So all these questions in the chat are great because these are all the same questions that I've been wrestling with. And like, again, we're not like, we don't know. There's a lot of things that we don't actually know. We don't actually have the evidence to back up like from this study. But there's other studies that are out there. There's other programs out there that we'll be happy to, like, we're going to mass share out sort of frequently asked questions and other surveys and other sort of data out there. But to answer that question really shortly, it works for some folks. Like, honestly, methadone and Suboxone works for some folks, but it doesn't work for everyone. It can't be a one size fits all, mainly because like there's a few proven problems with it. One is that it neglects all the stimulant users. So anyone who's on crystal meth methadone isn't what the drug of your choice. But it's also very similar. Safe supply is actually very similar and can be implemented very similarly to methadone. It's just simply different medication. And so what's the main difference is the fact that sometimes we neglect the fact that people are using substances for a reason, and like I want to be like honest in saying that like some people are like medicating beyond just withdrawal, but they're medicating their mental health, they're medicating their past traumas. There's lots of things going on, and so they're still seeking that sort of mind-body altering that they don't get with methadone or Suboxone. And to be honest, a lot of people are still mixing. Like methadone is still great. I still want people on methadone, but people are still also using unregulated drugs on top of methadone. So clearly, it's not enough for folks, and so they're still at risk of overdose, and they're still out there hustling. And so it's providing people with what they want, really, and not just being like, how is the bare minimum that we can give you, because people will shy away. We see this, like the amount of people that the retention rate is not that great. The amount of people that go on and off it all the time. Safe supply, the evidence out there is that people actually stay on the program, stay with it because it's what they want. And yeah, it just works out. Next question.
I don't know if Sarah wanted to add anything, but yeah, in the main, methadone or Suboxone, buprenorphine, doesn't scratch the itch for everybody, right? And you saw the data. Most of the people that we had spoken to have tried that route, sometimes more than once, and for them it had not been successful. So yeah, it's an option for people who want to go down that road. That remains an option. It's certainly cheaper than the amount of money being spent on the unregulated drugs, but there's some really neat double-blind studies, RCTs, comparing methadone with hydromorphone, an opioid, or heroin, also an opiate. So we can dig into some of that at another time. Got a couple of questions here. It's a 2-for-1. One is the question is about why not fentanyl as a safe supply option, like the patch or something like that. And a second question around the Ontario formulary as a systemic barrier to safe supply. So 2 questions, 1 answer. Short story is, since the bootleg fentanyls came into the market in a really big way in 2015, 16, and every year since, people's tolerance has gone through the roof. At the same time, what's happened in Ontario is the establishment is sort of catching up with the overprescribing, dosage, and duration of prescription opioids. So they got dialed back at a time and then replaced by the unregulated market. And so the formulations that are available through the Ontario formulary or the drug benefit plan, they tend to be the lower dose opioids like Dilaudid 8s and that kind of thing. So it's a problem because if they're not on the formulary, then it becomes extremely expensive to sort of fund the kinds of opioids or the kinds of dosages that people need, right? So there's a group of, I think Perry Kendall, the former chief medical officer of health for British Columbia, is involved, and others, high-end researchers are bringing pharmaceutical heroin to Canada, right? Typically, that would have been imported overseas, hugely expensive, not on the formulary, supported by the federal government. The cost for that will run about $21 a day if there's enough people in Ontario to take advantage of it. So that's the short story there. There's been a lot of advocacy, not a lot of movement on the formulary itself. But yeah, excellent question. And if people are wondering what they can do, connect with people with a provincial portfolio to maybe suggest. The Alliance for community health centers, I think, is also weighed in, but among many, many others. We've got another question. Sorry, Jesse, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, there's lots of sort of similar questions. I'm trying to group some of them together. Like, there's some questions around like a CTS. How could they be involved, or what does that look like, or how do you make sure that people are redirected, or is there going to be services with it? Like, there's lots of ways that we could implement safe supply. Anywhere from like something that has wraparound services that is dedicated a whole building and like lots of sort of workers there to help them with all their sort of needs. And then there's sort of more emergency sort of response where we are just trying to get as many people a prescription to get to the pharmacy as possible, like so that we can curb some of these deaths. But there's a range of ways that we can implement it. I would advocate for like lots of all the different ranges. We will need a diverse range of ways to implement safe supply. But like, could it be out of a CTS? Yes, I can't speak for them, but we could do it out of there for sure. And so forth. But I just wanted to, like, I saw a bunch of you were asking a similar question around that. So I just wanted to address that.
Awesome. There's a couple of questions around what are the best ways to advocate for bringing safe supply to Waterloo Region, what kind of conversations are happening at regional council around decriminalization, legalization, where are we in terms of creating policy change. So I think, we could talk about ways that we might be able to push the policy dial the right way, maybe in a follow-up conversation. So I think in the survey, if you're interested in more conversations or advancing safe supply or sanctioned consumption sites, then yeah, do leave your email and we'll get a Zoom link together and maybe have some of those discussions. It's early days for sure. In terms of conversations at Regional Council, on behalf of the Crime Prevention Council, Jesse and I were able to bring some of this research before them last week. And the feedback has been lots of engagement. So these are early days. We haven't talked about, I'm not aware of any discussions at Regional Council around legalization and legalization, or decriminalization and legalization. Even the bill before the Senate that I mentioned, S229, it's early days for the Crime Prevention Council. So short story, I think we could have a lot of really fantastic conversations about where we might want to go and how we might plan to get there in a follow-up. So what else do we have in terms of questions here? What would be the strict regulations on how do we ensure that all people who need access to safe supply gain access? Good question. There is for safe supply, there is a bit of an operating manual. There's a community of practice that exists in Ontario. Dr. Sareda, I think someone mentioned her. She's the physician at the Community Health Centre in London, Dr. Ray in Toronto out of Parkdale, a few others. I mean, we're having those conversations, but it's not a free-for-all. It is very much a regulated substance, and there's very much guidelines for prescribers. So that's currently what prescribers are following. And the risk is, and I think the prescribing physicians would agree, the risk is that it becomes a highly medicalized system, and those in need of safe supply are unable to access it. I think of Julian Tudor Hart writing in the Lancet 1971. He pitched something called the inverse care law, which said that those most in need of health and medical services are least likely to receive it. That is a phenomenon that's definitely underway, and that's the risk in an over-medicalized regime, whether it's consumption services or safe supply. So, good question, lots of conversations. I mean, this is new territory for a lot of folks here. What else do we have in terms of questions here? What are some of the negative issues you would see arise with safe supply from both the recipient, community, and organization involved in the supply? That's a good question. What we always want to pay attention to are unanticipated or unintended consequences. I think back to 2012 when Purdue pulled OxyContin, and the governments of the day were, they were scrambling, right? But they pulled it. as from the formulary as well. And people thought, oh, this is great. All the problems are going to go away. We've taken the drug. And that's not what happened. And it's not what the community said would happen. But here we are. In terms of negative issues, I would see rising with safe supply. It's hard to imagine, honestly. There are risks, and it's probably a more detailed conversation, but compared to the benefits, probably quite small. We asked in the focus groups if there would be a risk of diversion. People generally thought no, that it's such a small amount. People wouldn't get jumped for those safe supply. And we asked some of those questions in the research that through the unsafe research, but people didn't anticipate a lot of negative impacts. I don't know if you had anything to offer, Jesse, on this one.
No, not really. That one was no. I don't because I can't really see too far into the future. When my first reaction to a lot of these questions is, hey, let's ask our folks. Let's ask our folks what they think around these things. We did ask some similar questions in our survey that we didn't get time to share with you around how would they implement safe supply and what would the risk be for you and others. And they did answer those questions and they had a lot of great feedback. But I would say we should be asking sort of the folks directly involved what they would think about what the negative consequences are. Sarah, there's a question in there I want to direct at you. Is that people are just saying what would people do with all that? They're saying oh, if all that free time is freed up, then what other things could people do?
Yeah. So the reality for somebody who would be applying for a program like this, it's probably not a reality that any of us probably could imagine. And so to try to anticipate and try to imagine and come up with scenarios that folks would be going in such different situations is nearly impossible and a bit just absurd, especially when we have a crowd of people that are willing to talk to us and share, mostly because they're happy that somebody is concerned and worried about them. So for me, sometimes it's funny that, we try to come up with these public health concepts and ideas, and we want one program to fix it all. When we do have an understanding that if we look upstream, the issues are complicated and large and they're systemic. And so to be able to just create one program that we're going to keep at $2.5 million a year nationwide, and we're going to solve all these humongous systemic problems, it's almost unfair and unrealistic, I think. And we don't, I think we don't question other things this way. And so, and then the next thing that we want to do is highly regulated, because this group of folks can't be trusted, right? For whatever reason you think that. And so, so for me, it's hard to be able, I'm with you. We have to go out and ask the community how this will impact them and how it'll affect them. I think people will be restful. I think people will find themselves being able to rest if they have medication in their system that will allow them to rest, that will allow them to exit the withdrawal symptoms. You can get some sleep, you can get food in you. If that's what you're wanting, if there's those medical pieces that you haven't attended to because you've been busy trying to get that medication so that you don't go through the withdrawal symptoms, there's a huge amount of things. But first of all, people get to rest, people get to sleep, people get to eat, people get to feel human again, and that is huge. I think a lot of folks are sort of getting those tiny breaks by being able to access hospitals, but at that point, and this isn't a judgment in the system of the hospitals, but a lot of times we don't know what to do once somebody that is using such high dosage of street level medication is coming in, and if they're in pain management becomes an issue, and so we don't know how to approach that either, and so lots of advocacy in that way. Anyways, we're learning tons in those ways. Then cut me off if I'm rambling. I get excited about this stuff and I could talk forever. But yeah, I think going back out, continuing to be brave, going out, listening to folks, and then being brave enough to follow through, and put money where our mouth is, right? I mean, we're going out. If they're gonna give us suggestions, if they're gonna tell us ideas and share their thoughts, then we have to be brave enough to try to follow and support some of those thinkings.
Yeah, it's a great question, and for some people, like particularly, people who've been victims of early childhood abuse, trauma, and neglect, having that extra time on their hands, it would be quite helpful to have some support services in place, because some of the experience in British Columbia is some of that trauma really starts to surface, right? It's not numbed by in the same way that it was before. So the other thing I just want to add is, there's a reason homelessness declines, education, attainment improves, sex work declines, treatment of medical conditions improves, et cetera, et cetera. And that's partly through the availability of time and a decriminalized life in a way that it simply wasn't before. So we're, I know, cognizant of the time here, and we said we'd wrap up around 3. Just a few more questions. Someone's asking about who would pay for the drugs. Yeah, it's a mixed bag right now. If it's on the formulary, then that would typically be covered by drug benefits. But for drugs that are not, that's a tremendous cost. And the irony doesn't escape me, I assure you, of paying pharmaceutical companies for drugs that, just 15 years ago, we were saying like, maybe not so much. So it's a really mixed bag. It's not a really clean system. Yeah, that's the really short story here. And then of course, prescribers like nurse practitioners or physicians are sort of the gatekeepers, if you will. It's not something that you can do off the side of your desk. And physicians who are involved will tell you, London, Toronto, different Victoria, and so on, will tell you that no, there is unlimited, seemingly unlimited demand. And even if we were to have a program that could serve, 200 people, we'd be scratching the surface. It would be 200 very lives saved, probably, but it would just be scratching the surface. So yeah, any well-heeled philanthropists on the call, the phone lines are open, if you will. So I am cognizant of the time here, and I think maybe just we'll get to some of these questions and answers in the FAQ that will emerge. We'll knock our heads together and try and provide reasonable answers for the folks who took time to ask questions. I don't know if there was any concluding comments from Sarah or Jesse before we wrap up and say goodbye. I look at both of you. Yeah,
you're on mute.
He's on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying that I was really excited about all the questions, and so I was just trying to answer them individually. But we will send out more information post webinar.
Yeah, I want to be able to just encourage people to reach out to us and email. The COVID restrictions make it difficult for a coffee and a walk, but seriously, this is, however people can connect and can talk this stuff through is amazing and great. It's a system we're wanting to change and make an impact on, right? That's where we're headed. So, yeah.
Well, on behalf of the Crime Prevention Council and Jesse and Sarah and the team working in the shadows to support this webinar and the research, thank you so much for your time and attention today. Please do fill out that survey. It really does make a difference in the work going forward. And on behalf of all of us here, thank you for your continued efforts to save lives, reduce harm, and prevent those conditions from happening in the first place. Big love from 73 Queen Street North. Thank you.